Welcome back, travelers, adventurers. You know, it was not so long ago that a storm such as this ravaged Sturmland all the way to the gates of Blickwell. It was at this very inn, the Steadfast Siren, that a mage sat at a bar while the doors shook violently. A mage dressed in all red. Waves rolled in from the eastern seas as the rivers began to flood. Many sought refuge in this land of storms. Titanic walls and gates were built throughout Sturmland for this exact scenario, but this was no natural storm. No such winds had passed through the elven valleys in 1,000 years. This mage sat at the bar, pipe lit, smoke billowing from the red embers, his face hidden from those in the tavern, adorning leather armor quite unusual for a mage of the Grand Order. The insignia of a raven on his belt gave this away. The silver elven sword affixed to his hip was curious. A battle mage in these parts? While the intentions of this mage were curious, no one in the tavern seemed to take notice. They were far too busy boarding up the windows to care. Water had begun to flood into the streets. Fortunately, all businesses in this town of Stramford were raised above the streets. Sturmland was no stranger to the storms from the seas. Even so, the men grew nervous. The barkeep himself was piling up bags of flour from the kitchen alongside the doors and windows. He'd hoped they would help if the flooding started. "Aye, lads, I haven't seen a storm like this in my lifetime. What have the eastern winds brought upon us?" the barkeep said softly to himself. "We've angered the storm gods, no doubt. Our dissension in Sturmland angers them," one man shouted. "Oh, shut your yapping. Adelgis has been splintered for over 100 years. This is something else, lads," another man countered. The mage perked up a bit as the crackling and rumbling of thunder pierced all their ears. He felt magic in the air, exhaling smoke in the shape of birds from his thin, pale lips. The mage grabbed his black staff and stood up from the bar. Looking out the window before it was boarded up, he saw into the storm. Lightning shot across the sky like roots from a tree, filling the night with blinding light. The ground rumbled with the strength of titans. Even a mage with his experience could not surmise the cause of such turbulent weather, but the tingling across his skin told him magic was involved in some way. Whether this was the work of gods or men, he did not know. What he did know was that every passing moment the storm strengthened. For now, they were safe. But how long would this illusion of safety endure? The men finished their reinforcements on the bar, and a couple of the barmaids began to pass out mugs of ale, free of charge. "On the house, lads," the barkeep called out. One was slid across to the mage as he sauntered back over to the bar. "One for you too, just for being around." "Thanks," the mage replied, drinking from his wooden mug. "So what's a mage of the Grand Order doing in these parts?" the barkeep asked. The red mage looked up. "I don't mean to pry, lad. I just haven't seen your kind in some time." "It's all right. I was on a mission to recover something in Blickwell, but the storm held me up. I hoped it would simply pass, but seems like I'm stuck here for now. Wizard don't take too kindly to the rain, eh?" "Not this one," he responded, the amber stone in his staff shimmering against the candlelight. A powerful breeze rolled in, blowing the door open and sending chills down the spines of all of those in the Steadfast Siren. Immediately, all of the candles were blown out. The barkeep and another man quickly rushed to the door to hold it closed, as they grabbed a board and nails. The mage in red raised his staff, and with a glow of the stone inside it, branches began to grow across the door from one side to the other, keeping it closed. The men jumped back in fear, but much to their surprise, the door was entirely reinforced with branches, and the candles in the inn were instantly relit with flames, far brighter than before. "To the mage!" a few of the other men called out, raising their mugs. The cloaked man raised his in response, a slight smirk across his maw. "What's your name, son?" one of the men asked. "It's Igni. They call me Igni the Red," he responded, removing the hood of his cloak to reveal a fair-skinned man with crimson-colored hair pulled back and tied. His eyes were an unnatural amber color, not unlike the stone in his staff. This was no doubt rooted in his magical origins. "We welcome you, Igni the Red." Another round of clanking mugs and applause rang out across the inn. "Have you ever seen a storm like this, Mr. Wizard?" one man asked. Igni paused for a moment before holding his mug close. "Not in my time as a mage." "How long has that been, mister?" 260 years or so." The men in the bar nearly gasped at this. They knew mages lived unnatural lives, some even for thousands of years, but to meet someone who had lived over 3 lifetimes was another feeling altogether, especially one who looked not a day over 30. As the men talked and drank, something began to lurk in Stramford. The storm intensified, shaking the inn. Water flooded into the streets, nearly to the door of the inn itself. One of the boards against the windows began to come loose. The thunder continued to rumble the city relentlessly, only seeming to grow stronger. Unease festered in the hearts of the men and women in the inn. Igni could sense it. Whatever was the cause of this storm was soon to show its ugly face. Just outside the city, cracks began to form in the floodgates. Water was pouring into the city unlike anything the city guard had ever seen. The outer parts of the settlement needed to be evacuated. The water in these once crystalline rivers was now darker than the deepest depths of the seas. The city guards could see movement on the horizon. For a moment, a flash of lightning revealed a serpent-like entity in the skies, and just as quickly as it had been seen, it was now gone. The rivers were overflowing, and the winds were now so intense that the guards could no longer hold these walls. Evacuations to higher ground had begun, and walls that took years to build now began to crack and fall. Water flooded into the lower parts of the settlement, forcing many to swim or utilize chunks of their homes as makeshift rafts. It was truly a tragic series of events. Back at the inn, Igni drank and talked to the men. The magic he felt earlier seemed to have gone, but he could not escape this feeling of dread and unease. The ground began to rumble once more, but this was far more jarring than before. Removing the branches at the door, Igni was compelled to step outside. Slamming his staff into the ground, he saw it. Swirling wind as tall as the sky. A tornado. Touching down just outside the settlement, wind pushed Igni against the wall of the inn. He had to do something. The town had already suffered much damage, but combating a weather phenomenon such as this would be no easy task. Creating a field of energy around himself, the raindrops seemed to bounce off it and hit the ground. The wind tried to push him down, but he was not falling. Floating above the flooded streets, he gave every ounce of strength to maintaining his concentration on this spell. Landing on a nearby roof, he aimed his staff at the swirling wind, strong enough to knock over any man. "Here goes nothing. All Father help me," he muttered to himself, as wind began to spiral out of his staff. What other way to beat a tornado than with more wind? While fighting fire with fire was dangerous, Igni knew this would disrupt it, but the physical toll it was going to take on him would strain his muscles. For magic, my dear adventurers, requires energy, just like any physical activity. The more you use it, the more it drains you. Igni was a powerful mage. He could take it, but even he could feel his body begin to tense up, fatigue setting in. The tornado was disrupted by his spell as 2 opposing forces entered a fierce struggle for what seemed like an eternity, before it dissipated. Falling to the ground, Igni gasped for air. He did it. The town was safe. Or so it seemed. Taking deep breaths, he needed a moment to recover. As such, the rain began to fall against his crimson cloak and leather armor. Looking up to the sky, he could see the moon for just a moment before it was swallowed in a maelstrom of storm clouds. Managing to get to his feet, Igni watched the outer walls crumble and fall. Hundreds began to evacuate to higher ground. "You've got this, Igni," he whispered to himself. Leaping across to another roof, he aimed his staff at the flooded streets, lifting up a wall of stone that towered over the nearby buildings. he was able to stop the flooding from continuing into the upper parts of Stramford. This allowed the citizens to make their escape. Floating over to the wall, he helped dozens clear the barrier he had created, but the force of the waves and wind began to weaken his hold on it. They had to move quickly. Lightning lit up the sky once more, and Igni spotted something in the distance that the guards had seen earlier. It was easily hundreds of miles away, but he spotted that serpentine body in the sky, if only for a mere moment. Then it was gone. Had his eyes played tricks on them? There was no sign of what he had seen now, only swirling storm clouds. Looking down into the waters of the lower levels, he spotted movement in the shallow. Lots of movement. He could not tell if it was just citizens attempting to swim to safety, or something else. He dared not move in closer to get a better look. Unfortunately for the mage, what lurked in the floods wanted to get a better look at him. "Run!" he called out to the people below, leaping from the wall. It was shattered as stone was shot across the town. Massive holes pierced into several buildings. There was now a rather large hole in the barrier. Water began to flood into the streets of the upper levels. Revealing itself from the waters was a horde of creatures from the deep, the likes of which were not native to this part of Arcadia. Various sea beasts with spikes and tendrils burst into the city with ferocity and killing intent that could be felt even by the mage. Were these monsters tied to the storm? Or perhaps did they end up here as a byproduct of the inclement weather? As much as Igni would have liked to ponder the situation, there was no time. Slamming his staff into the ground once more, he parted the water that flooded into the streets, sending blasts of pure mana or magical energy at the creatures. He managed to wound a few of them. There were dozens now, flooding into the streets, reptilian and amphibian monsters, some bipedal while others stood on four legs. They screeched into the night with such intensity that it shook the very spirit of the wizard. Gritting his teeth, he floated up to higher ground. Preparing a magical attack, a large tentacle sent him into a nearby shop. His body was covered in bruises, but he was able to soften the blow with his magic. Relinquishing the elven sword he kept at his hip from its scabbard, Igni stepped back out into the streets. Water was waist high now, but he did not care. They did not call him a battle mage for nothing. Slicing through one of the oncoming tentacles, he parted the water once more, his eyes glowing bright orange. His entire body began to tingle as his veins pulsed with mana. Blasting several of the beasts back, he slashed through the others, purple blood splattering across the water. What was left of the city guard fired their arrows down at the beasts, attempting to aid the mage in his fight. The Stramford settlement truly was in peril, but not all was lost. Igni stood in the darkness like a torch to light the way. As long as his will endured, so would he. The Grand Order did not train weak-willed mages. Ducking down to dodge a slash from one of the more reptilian beasts, his silver sword shimmered with electricity as he cut open the monster. Floating up into the air, he got a good look around at the situation. The citizens had evacuated the area, so only monsters remained in the floods. An idea struck the battle mage, one that would turn the tide in favor of the town. Channeling as much mana as he had left to wield, electricity began to surge around his staff as his eyes glowed a pale blue. Shouting at the top of his lungs, he fired a ferocious bolt of lightning into the water. For a moment, there was a bright flash of light. Then there was screaming. The creatures cried in agony as they were fried by the lightning. It filled the water and reached out to every beast within a few hundred meters of the mage. Falling to his knees, steam emanated from his body as he was exasperated. His headstrong use of magic had taken a serious toll on his physical state. Gasping for air, he took a moment to himself. The storm seemed to have calmed down, but the rain did not cease. Droplets falling onto Igni's face. He looked up to the sky. Something was wrong. The flooding had begun to recede, and far too much. This may have seemed like a good sign to normalize, but to the experienced mage, he knew this was bad. Looking back out to the edge of the settlement, he spotted something. A gargantuan tidal wave heading their way. It crashed through the trees in the distance, coming from the sea in an almost unnatural manner. No, he said. His body was worn out, but he couldn't let the entire town be crushed by the seas. Running from rooftop to rooftop, he made his way to the edge of where the walls once were. Taking a deep breath, he readied himself. This was it. All or nothing. Death did not scare him. Failure did. He'd taken an oath when joining the Order that he'd give his life in service if he had to. A service to the people of this continent, regardless of background or political affiliation. So there he stood before the massive wave. Calling out in Elven, he began to chant. Calling to the heavens, he shouted, "On the names of my ancestors, I will not let this city perish." With all of his might, he used sheer mana to block the wave. It was almost like smacking an invisible barrier, the water lifting into the air as it was halted. Sliding against the stone, he struggled to keep it at bay. The people of this town were powerless to help him. Nonetheless, they watched in faith. High above somewhere, he imagined the gods watched too. What did they think of this? Groaning in pain as his muscles began to burn, he could tell he was overusing his magic. No mage had stopped a disaster of this scale in nearly a millennia. This was not exactly something one trained for. With all his might, he managed to halt the wave, and the water fell back down to the earth. The lower parts of town were flooded once more, but the settlement was saved from devastation. Igni fell to his knees in the water that now went up to his neck. It soothed his pain as he teetered back and forth between consciousness. One of the city guards came to pick him up. He was brought to an inn, the Steadfast Siren. Being immediately recognized by the barkeep, he was given aid and proper bed to sleep on. Many had lost faith in the Grand Order to protect them in this age, but this act of valor was a key step in restoring the people's faith in them. If only they knew the danger that was to come. What Igni and the town guard had seen in the skies would haunt them for countless nights, but that's another story altogether. For now, I leave you with this ending. Igni regained consciousness after some much-needed rest. Those in the town thanked him, and he began his journey to Blickwell once more. This was not the last Arcadia would hear of the Red Mage, but it was the first of many important tales in his legacy. Again, thank you guys so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was a bit of an improvement on the previous episode. I did some more work on the editing and the audio and such, so I hope you liked it. You know what to do. Comment, subscribe, like, anything at all will help with the weird YouTube algorithm. And if you're interested in reading some of my other works, I do have a book published. I will be putting the link to that book down in the description below, and when I publish my next one, I'll also be advertising that one as well on my videos, and I'll put those links up too. And if you want to follow me on Facebook, it'll be facebook.com/poemsandembers. You can look at all the different poems and stuff I put there. I put these episodes on there as well. And I'll be looking into adding some more social media stuff as we go. So thanks again.